They add this weird thing about putting coins on the eyes. Obviously, coins didn't exist yet in this time.
Is this what you left me for?
And that, I love that line because, I mean, I really don't want to endorse this kind of morality, but that is so Homeric. Are those llamas? There are some llamas in the scene, ladies and gentlemen. Hello everyone, my name is Roel Konijnendijk. I'm an ancient historian at the University of Oxford, and I'm here to offer a deep dive into the movie Troy with History Hit. Troy is a movie version of one of the most famous stories to emerge out of ancient Greece. In fact, recorded in the earliest literary source from the ancient Greek world, the Iliad, an epic poem supposedly written by the possibly fictional poet Homer, but so famous both in the ancient and the modern world that we're still making adaptations of this great story of the great war on Troy and its eventual fall and the repercussions it had for the heroes and characters involved. All right. So we open on this map of Greece 3,200 years ago. So it's set in the Bronze Age, which is itself an interesting choice. And it's very interesting looking at this map. There are a lot of things that are featured that are kind of weird to include. Thea, which is where Achilles is from, is definitely in the wrong place. Salamis is there, but not Athens, presumably because Ajax is one of the characters. There's a town called Boibet north of Thessaly. I don't know what Boibet is. But yeah, we have to start on this map. And then, after decades of warfare, it says, Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, has forced the kingdoms of Greece into a loose alliance. Only Thessaly remains unconquered. This, I think, is really just a setup for the opening scene in which Thessaly then is conquered.
The ruler of Thessaly carries this scepter. Give it to your king.
The idea here is that Agamemnon is a sort of emperor rather than king, that he rules over the rest of the Greek world. And I think this is kind of the overlay that this movie chooses, in which it turns into a story of imperialism, right? The whole war against Troy is about Agamemnon wanting more power, wanting to conquer territory and opening trade routes or whatever else.
You can't have the whole world, Agamemnon. It's too big, even for you.
All of this is essentially not in the sources at all. This is just modern rationalization. And this happens in almost every version of the story that you see nowadays, is that they try to turn this into some kind of something that makes sense from a modern perspective of how states operate. In the ancient world, the Greeks never suggested that this war was about anything else other than the fact that Helen had been stolen, had been abducted, or had been sort of seduced away from her actual husband, and the Greeks had to get her back. Agamemnon's brother Menelaus, king of Sparta, is weary of battle. He seeks to make peace with Troy, the most powerful rival to the emerging Greek nation. It's arguable, based on Hittite sources, that the Achaeans that inhabited Greece at this time, and that is the way that the Hittites referred to them, had some dealings with the people around Troy, maybe even fought some wars with people on that coast. This is in the late Bronze Age, but we have no sense that Homer or the epic cycle preserves any real memory of such a conflict. So it's kind of trying to blend real history with the story that survives by making Agamemnon into this expansionist king, making Troy into his rival, and then having Menelaus being sort of like the weakest link in that chain, somebody who wants to actually stop this expansion and enjoy peace. It's very strange because Menelaus is later introduced as a very sort of warmongering, aggressive man who doesn't seem to enjoy anything but violence. And so I don't really see how this fits together, even in the story, the way that they're telling it. Emerging Greek nation is highly anachronistic, I would say. Nations in general don't exist. There is no word for this in anything this early. The only thing I would say to that is that the Iliad is the earliest source in which, obviously it's the earliest text that survives, in which the Greeks are referred to collectively, but they're not referred to by their later name, the Hellenes. They are called Danaians, Achaeans, or Argives, which are all pars pro toto, so they are all references to individual small regions which stand for the whole. Achilles, considered the greatest warrior ever born, fights for the Greek army, but his disdain for Agamemnon's rule threatens to break the fragile alliance apart. What? I mean, they're really trying to get ahead of themselves here and saying there's already a conflict between Achilles and Agamemnon. We have no reason to think that there should be. Achilles at this point is not part of the great alliance of Agamemnon. He is not a member of this whole system, as far as we know. He later joins because Odysseus persuades him to join. Achilles has nothing to do with Agamemnon and probably doesn't have much of an opinion about him one way or the other. But of course, later on in the story that the Iliad tells, a conflict erupts between Agamemnon and Achilles, which we'll hear more about later. And that is why eventually all of the events of the Iliad unfold. So this kind of thing is them just kind of try to plant that seed so that it's easier to understand for the viewer, I think. But it's a very odd sentence to place here because, you know, there's nothing behind it. So this is the fateful scene at Sparta in which we see the Trojans and the Spartans celebrating their new peace treaty. And then later on we find out that Paris, one of those princes, has in the meantime been developing an affair with Helen, wife of Menelaus, and is going to steal her away.
Hector, Paris, young princes, come, stand. Drink with me. Let us drink to peace.
To peace.
In the actual story, Paris is just in Sparta and there meets Helen. Menelaus then goes off to Crete on some kind of mission, for some kind of reason, and Paris is left more or less to his own devices and decides to seduce and steal away the Queen of Sparta. Why this scene has been turned into a peace negotiation or peace conference followed by a treaty is entirely because of this same idea that this is now a story about imperialism. This is now a story about different states that are rivals for power. And so, of course, when they treat with each other, it's not on a personal level. It's not, you know, these great lords meeting each other and doing gift exchange between each other like they do in the Homeric poems, but rather making treaties and you know, establishing rules about war and peace and about territory and about rights and whatever else. That is this modern mold into which the story has been pushed. In the story, as far as we know, Paris is simply traveling around, as a lot of these great lords do a lot. They just travel around, meet people, establish relations, exchange gifts. This is a way for them to both gain wealth and essentially establish themselves in the world. They're making themselves known. This is something that in the Odyssey, for instance, Telemachus, the son of Odysseus, does. He just travels around letting everyone know, hey, I'm an adult now. You should know me. Give me presents. And this is the kind of thing that Paris is doing here. And because this is Paris traveling around doing this, Hector wasn't there. I mean, nothing in the story says that Hector was actually there in Sparta too.
Do you love me, brother? Would you protect me against any enemy?
The last time you spoke to me like this, you were 10 years old and you'd just stolen Father's horse. What have you done now?
I must show you something.
I want her back.
I thought you wanted peace with Troy.
I should have listened to you.
Peace is for the women.
The Trojans spat on my honor. An insult to me is an insult to you.
And an insult to me is an insult to all Greeks.
Will you go to war with me, brother?
So again, this is a rewriting of the story in which, for Agamemnon, this is just a pretext. You know, he wants this war because he's an expansionist ruler. He wants to expand his empire. And Menelaus is almost like a fool for his designs. He is the one who handily gives him the pretext. In the actual story, there is nothing like this. What actually happens is both Agamemnon and Menelaus were suitors for Helen's hand when it was announced that she was of age to marry, along with rulers from all over the Greek world. She picked one of them, Menelaus, after which all the other suitors were made to swear a pact that they would preserve the sanctity of this marriage. So they would protect Helen and they would protect her marriage to Menelaus. That is the oath they swore, and that is why they go to war. The entire war happens because of this pact, which was the oath between the suitors, which involves pretty much everyone else who is in this story, because they were all suitors for the hand of supposedly the most beautiful woman, daughter of Zeus, etc., etc. And in fact, Agamemnon married one of her sisters. Odysseus married one of her relatives as well. So there were sort of like consolation prizes in that process. But all of them have been made to swear that they would uphold this marriage. And when they go to war, it is out of this obligation, out of the oath that they swore, not because either they're following Agamemnon or because they have expansionist designs.
Please, brother. We were told King Odysseus is hid in the hills.
Odysseus? That old bastard drinks my wine and never pays.
You ought to respect your king, friend.
Respect him? I'd like to punch him in the face. He was pouring at my wife, trying to tear her clothes off. I hope Agamemnon's generals are smarter than his emissaries.
Agamemnon, having sort of decided to go to war, calls upon all the other kings to come and help him, so he sends messengers out. They send a messenger out to Odysseus, and in this scene, which I think is only in the extended cut, but he pretends that he is not the king. He pretends he doesn't know him, and he makes all these sort of veiled allusions to the idea that it's actually him, but they don't understand. So it's like trying to portray Odysseus as this wily character, which is very much what he is, of course, to some extent in the Iliad, but much more so in the Odyssey. It's how we know him. The odd thing is that they didn't actually use the story that we are told about Odysseus. When the call came, he didn't want to go to war because he had a newborn son, Telemachus, and he wanted to look after him. He wanted to stay at home with his wife, Penelope. And so what he did was he pretended to be mad. He sort of plowed his field in a weird way that seemed totally irrational and then started sowing it with salt. And the messengers initially thought, oh, this guy is not all there. Maybe we should leave him. But then they thought, maybe, wait a minute, this is Odysseus. He's probably trying to trick us. So what they did is they took the baby Telemachus and put it in front of his plow as he was plowing his field. And of course, he swerved to avoid murdering his own son, at which point they were like, we know who you are. So Odysseus has this whole story associated with him, which they didn't use, but instead they have him deceive the messengers in a different way.
Nervous? Petrified.
You told me never to change sword hands. Yes. When you know how to use it, you won't be taking my orders.
Your reputation for hospitality is fast becoming legend.
Patroclus, my cousin. Odysseus, king of Ithaca.
Patroclus. I knew your parents well.
They were cousins. It's an interesting thing that's often forgotten in the sort of backlash against this movie, presenting them as cousins, that they were cousins according to the story, or at least all the versions that we know. They share a grandmother. But it isn't important to Homer. In this poem, they're not presented as kinsmen. They're presented as, battle buddies. They're sort of best friends and mates for life. And later Greek authors have also introduced into that story this sort of homoerotic relationship between them. So they are lovers. But in this story, they are just presented as, he is his younger cousin. Achilles is sort of his guardian. He's looking after him, which is kind of a weird way to sanitize or to remove from this story anything that might affront conservative viewers.
Are you here at Agamemnon's bidding?
We need to talk. I'm not asking you to fight for him. I'm asking you to fight for Greece. They insulted Greece.
They insulted one Greek, a man who couldn't hold on to his wife. What business is that of mine?
Your business is war, my friend.
Is it? Am I the whore, the battlefield? The man has no honor. I won't be remembered as a tyrant's mercenary.
Let Achilles fight for honor. Let Agamemnon fight for power, and let the gods decide which man to glorify.
Achilles is easily persuaded because he wants glory, which does to some extent fit the story, but we're told that Achilles also didn't want to go and actually went to very great lengths to avoid being made part of this conflict because his mother didn't want him to risk his life. So he actually goes off on an island and hides among the handmaidens of another lord and dresses up as a woman to try and disguise himself, to try and hide his identity. And they trick him essentially by giving him a sword, where all the other women don't know how to handle this because they've never held a sword before, but for him it's very easy and he does it naturally and instinctively, and so that's when they know this is Achilles.
Forget Agamemnon. Fight for me. My wife will feel much better if she knows you're by my side. I'll feel much better.
Odysseus then does persuade Achilles to come along on this mission, and that is when when all the pieces are on the board. Are those llamas? There are some llamas in the scene, ladies and gentlemen. Obviously, they were filming this movie in Mexico. I think it must be why. They brought some pack animals in, and now there are llamas in the scene. So here we are. Some animals that definitely didn't exist in the Greek world, but, you know.
Mohammedans, my brothers of the sword. I'd rather fight beside you than any army of thousands. Let no man forget how menacing we are. We are lions. Do you know what's there? Waiting, beyond that beach. Immortality! Take it! It's yours!
So in the scene, the war has started, the Greeks have landed, and the first victory has been achieved. The beach has been taken, which they present as almost like a modern warfare scenario.
I've got something to show you. The men found her, hiding in the temple. They thought she'd, amuse you.
What's your name?
Odysseus.
The first spoils also have been taken, and at this point a lot of the Greek leaders, they present those spoils to Agamemnon in thanks for leading them on a victorious conquest, and we see the conflict emerging between Achilles and Agamemnon.
King Triopas, you have won a great victory, my King of Kings. No one thought the Trojan beach could be captured so easily.
A beautiful gift, Triopas.
So there are aspects of the scene that I really like because they're just so Homeric. You know, the whole exchange of gifts where basically people come up to Agamemnon and give him something and say, oh, you deserve this for leading us. And then Agamemnon gives them an honor in return. He says, you know, we will celebrate together in Troy, or you will be the first to walk in Troy. So he has this kind of way of understanding his role. Like, he is supposed to be generous. He's supposed to be seen to acknowledge the contributions of his subordinates, and they are supposed to give him things in return. So this is a very Homeric sort of environment in which this happens. And so in that sense, they really captured something of what the poem is like.
A great victory was won today. But that victory is not yours. Kings did not kneel to Achilles. Kings did not pay homage to Achilles.
Perhaps the kings were too far behind to see. The soldiers won the battle.
History remembers kings, not soldiers. Tomorrow we'll batter down the gates of Troy. I'll build monuments to victory on every island of Greece. I'll carve Agamemnon in the stone. My name will last through the ages. Your name is written in sand for the waves to wash away.
Be careful, King of Kings. First, you need the victory.
Your men sacked the temple of Apollo, yes?
You want gold? Take it. It's my gift to honor your courage. Take what you wish.
I already have. Afarius! Hemon!
Achilles has no gift for Agamemnon, and so he just takes this girl Briseis, who has been given to him by his own soldiers.
Tonight, I'll have her give me a bath. And then, who knows?
You sack of wine!
Achilles, when he's so offended that he actually draws his sword, he calls Agamemnon sack of wine, which is actually literally from the poem. He calls him full of wine, face of a dog, heart of a deer. He has all sorts of other choice insults, which to us seems slightly weird, but this is actually the kind of way in which he's trying to express that Agamemnon has gone too far and has now sort of lost the plot and no longer deserves to be followed by anyone, certainly not by Achilles.
Before my time is done, I will look down on your corpse and smile.
It's a very strange scene in the way that they're trying to sort of bring together a number of different things from the story, but also simplify them. The rift that develops in the story is because Agamemnon had his own enslaved woman from the spoils, Chryseis, but she was the daughter of a priest of Apollo. That priest invoked the wrath of Apollo on the Greek army unless he got his daughter back, and so driven by the fact that many Greeks were dying from the plague, because Apollo is of course the god of that stuff, he is forced to give Chryseis back, and in exchange he said, because I'm the greatest king of the Greeks, I deserve another prize, and so he takes Briseis from Achilles. And that's the moment where Achilles feels that he's been dishonored and he withdraws from the fighting. So the way that they've simplified that here, they've taken the character of Chryseis out entirely. They just have Briseis, who is herself a priestess of Apollo, which is kind of weird, but at the same time, it tries to retain some of those elements. And of course, Agamemnon still takes her from Achilles. The only thing is that in this version of the story, it's completely unmotivated. He just does that because he's greedy and he's a bad person. Whereas in the actual story, obviously, this has everything to do with this kind of sorting algorithm of honor that all of these Greek heroes believe that they ought to be given.
My lord? The army's marching.
Let them march, we stay.
But the men are ready.
We stay till Agamemnon groans to have Achilles back.
As you wish.
Yeah, so according to the story, Achilles, being so much better at fighting than any of the other Greeks, actually presents sort of the key advantage on which Greek hopes rest. So the fact that he withdraws from the fighting means that now the greatest fighter in this whole scenario sits on the Trojan side, Hector, and that means that the Greeks are actually potentially going to lose the entire war. So it matters that Achilles withdraws his support from Agamemnon and goes and sits in his tent, because that is going to determine the fate of the entire conflict. Although in the Iliad, a great deal of this also has to do with the will of the gods shifting the fates of both sides in their favor, because there are different gods who support both Greeks and Trojans. But in the story, and especially the way it's told here, without Achilles, they simply cannot win.
I brought all the warriors of Greece to your shores.
You can still save Troy, young prince.
I have two wishes. If you grant them, no more of your people need die. First, you must give Helen back to my brother. Second, Troy must submit to my command to fight for me whenever I call.
You want me to look upon your army and tremble? Well, I see them. I see 50,000 men brought here to fight for one man's greed.
Careful, boy. My mercy has limits.
And I've seen the limits of your mercy. And I tell you now, no son of Troy will ever submit to a foreign ruler.
Then every son of Troy shall die.
There is another way. I love Helen. I won't give her up, and neither will you. So let us fight our own battle. The winner takes Helen home. And let that be the end of it.
A brave offer, but not enough.
Let me kill this little peacock.
I didn't come here for your pretty wife. I came here for Troy.
I came for my honor.
insults me. Let me kill him. When he's lying in the dust, give the signal to attack. You'll have your city. I'll have my revenge.
So be it.
I accept your challenge. And tonight, I'll drink to your bones.
This scene of the duel between the two is taken directly from the Iliad. There is, in fact, a stage in this war where Paris agrees to fight Menelaus over Helen as a way to kind of resolve the whole thing. So between them, they try to decide it so that the rest of the army doesn't have to fight. No one else has to risk their lives. I love this scene. Everybody here, I think, is doing a fantastic job of expressing their characters, and especially sort of Brian Cox chewing the scenery is just such a joy to watch. But also Menelaus, who in this, so Brendan Gleeson playing Menelaus in this, being just this absolute brute of a man, and this is very much the role that he has in Kingdom of Heaven as well. He's just the one who does the violence, and that's what he lives for. And I think he's really great in his sort of physicality for that scene.
The crows. Never tasted prince before. What you left me for!
And I love that line because, I mean, I really don't want to endorse this kind of morality, but that is so Homeric. This is a world in which these men define themselves by their ability to do violence. This is the entire legitimization of their position. They are kings, they are in charge because they are fighters. And so when somebody runs away, when somebody proves incapable of fighting, it takes away everything that they have. You know, all of their possessions essentially become illegitimate because they are not able to stand up to each other, because they are not able to do violence. And so for a character like Menelaus, it should genuinely be incomprehensible that someone like Helen would want to leave him for a figure like Paris, who is comparatively weak and cowardly, or at least that's how he's presented. And so for Menelaus, this is, you know, a deeply in character for him to be shouting, "What are you doing? This is just not worthy of you. This is somebody who's clearly worse than me." And that is this whole Homeric vibe to the movie, the way that it tries to reflect the value system that's actually in the poem, which I really admire.
Fight me! You coward! Fight me! We have a pact! Fight! Fight him, son. Coward! Fight him.
Is this something that the Greeks actually did? Is a question I often get asked, especially because it's such a prominent feature of this film. And because, of course, this is directly taken from the Iliad. There are several scenes within the poem of these individual heroes kind of having an organized duel between each other. And these are very sort of rule-bound engagements. They'll have like demarcated battle zones, and they will like throw lots to see who can throw their spear first and things like that. It occurs in myth. There are several Greek mythological stories, and in fact, even some arguably historical stories in which these kind of duels to decide wars happen. The problem with them is that almost all of these stories, with one dubious exception, like they're supposed to have happened in the depths of time. They're untraceable. Like we don't really have any way of dating them. So even when they're presented by the ancient Greeks themselves as historical, we can't actually trust that they were. These were stories that were told. So there are various stories from the early archaic period, like the Iliad, which tell that, conflict was decided by duels between commanders instead of confrontations between whole armies. So firstly, we're not really sure if that ever actually happened, but even if it did, what a lot of those stories have in common is that the outcome ends up being disputed. As in this duel, Menelaus is beating Paris, he's dragging him off by his helmet when suddenly Aphrodite, who is personally involved on the Trojan side, makes his helmet chin strap snap so that Paris can be whisked away and Menelaus is left literally empty-handed. So the whole story ends with something that the Greeks regard as, a false ending. And in fact, at that point, one of the Trojans shoots an arrow at one of the Greeks, and the Greeks argue that the truce has been broken, the Trojans have broken the rules, and so all-out conflict resumes. That is often how these stories end, is that these duels are decided in a way that the other side doesn't think is fair, or they are not decided at all, and the result is that these armies go to war anyway. You can imagine that when you've brought together this much force, you're not likely to just accept the outcome of a single duel. You feel like you ought to do something here. The strength of your arms ought to have some say in this. And so these armies tend to find it very difficult to just say, like, okay, well, that's it. The matter is settled. Instead, they end up going out to all-out combat, either because they think that the duel was won unfairly, or because they simply think, even if it is fair, that it shouldn't be the end of the matter.
The Trojans have violated the agreement! Fight! Prepare for battle! Not honor! This is not worthy of royalty! If he doesn't fight, Troy is doomed.
Paris.
No.
The fight is over.
The fight is not over. Stand back, Prince Hector. I'll kill him at your feet, I don't care.
He's my brother.
The omens are gathering. The directive is clear.
Fight for your country, that's the only directive.
The last time the high priest spoke to us, he prophesied a great victory for Troy. We won a great victory. Let him speak.
And what's very interesting is that in several moments throughout the film, Hector is shown to be someone who disparages omens and doesn't seem to care, seems to be more rational than these people he's talking to, who believe that the gods will have their back and that the omens will tell them that good things are in store for them. Now, this is very unhistorical, very un-Greek in a lot of ways. There's no way that an actual Greek would be so dismissive of signs that they would genuinely have believed would have come from the gods, and certainly of priests who in their world had simply a better understanding of these things, were the only ones who might have access to the will of the gods.
The gods have cursed the Greeks. 2 of their kings have already gone down to the dust.
Prepare the army. We attack at daybreak.
Father, we're making a mistake.
Prepare the army.
Archers to the rear.
So one interesting feature about this battle is that obviously we've seen a couple of duels happen before, especially the one between Paris and Menelaus, at which point everybody was just kind of standing in line and waiting for that fight to be resolved. That kind of happens again here, but naturally, almost sort of spontaneously, everybody stops fighting and watches Patroclus fight Hector. This is very strange. In the Iliad, obviously, there are many encounters between different warriors, but in the poem, those encounters are often described as one part of the fighting, after which he will go and move on to another part. The fighting is very fluid. People can sort of, throw a javelin, miss, and hit somebody else, or, accidentally hit someone who's standing by, or go after another hero, ignore that they're being attacked because they're already fighting someone else. It's very confused, very chaotic. It's very interesting then to see that Hector is sort of very distraught by this. He's very upset that he seems to have killed this young boy rather than Achilles, because he thought that's what he was doing, and instead he seems to have killed this younger kid who wasn't deserving of that kind of level of wrath, apparently. It's very odd because Hector, obviously, in this movie is presented as this, as we said, this ideal of masculinity, this great man. And so, of course, he doesn't want to go and kill little baby Gareth Hedlund. He wants to kill Achilles. That's his role in this war. And so he feels that he's done something wrong, and quite probably, invokes some wrath. He knows the story. He knows what's going to happen, presumably, as does everybody else around. And there's very clearly these reactions that you get from Odysseus and Eudorus that this is going to have major consequences. What's very interesting here is, firstly, they present Patroclus' move as a deception. No one seems to know that he's doing this, when in fact in the poem, he convinces Achilles that he should. Achilles endorses it. Achilles speaks to the Myrmidons and says, follow him. The Trojans are briefly puzzled because they think it might be Achilles because he's wearing Achilles' armor, but they soon find out. And there is not really any sort of big revelation. It's just Sarpedon eventually just points it out, or Glaucon, his brother, points it out and says that's Patroclus, go fight him. So there's not really that same level of deception, which is made to be a big part of the scene here. In fact, in the big battle between Patroclus and Hector, Hector doesn't know that he's fighting Patroclus rather than Achilles, and neither do Odysseus or Eudorus, the sort of lieutenant of Achilles, realize that the man who is fighting there in Achilles' armor is not Achilles.
Hector!
So this then is the result of the killing of Patroclus, is that Achilles does come back, wants to fight again, wants to avenge his cousin.
I've seen this moment in my dreams. I'll make a pact with you. With the gods as our witnesses. Let us pledge that the winner will allow the loser all the proper funeral rituals.
There are no pacts between lions and men.
Brad Pitt outright quoting Homer in this scene. He's saying there are no pacts between lions and men, rejecting the truce that Hector proposes or the agreement that Hector proposes to treat each other's bodies with respect. Achilles rejects that in exactly the terms that Achilles does in the Iliad. Looks absolutely fantastic on film. I think this is one of the best duels ever filmed, but in terms of historical combat, it's a complete fantasy. This is just a bunch of guys twirling around each other, slapping each other with spears. It has absolutely no bearing on any ancient or modern understanding of what combat looked like. It's so showy, it's so beautiful, and also, the music really reinforces it. The actors really sell their parts. It's telling a story about the way that these characters are more of a match for each other than anybody else has ever been a match for Achilles. And that's kind of thing, it makes it really interesting to watch. We just kind of have to set aside our understanding of this as a reflection of Iliadic combat. The actual fight in the Iliad is, to be honest, to a modern audience, a huge letdown. one side throws a spear and misses, the other side throws a spear and misses, and then Achilles gets his spear back because Athena brings it back to him, pops it back into his hand, and so he gets another go and kills Hector. It's over in 3 strokes, that's it. All of the duels in the Iliad are like this. The overwhelming number of deaths in the Iliad, and there are very many that are described in gruesome detail, most of them are fights that are over in 1 strike. Somebody throws a spear or hits somebody with a sword, and that's it, it's over. Even wounds that, in theory to us, should not be fatal are described as causing death, so bringing about the death of one of these figures. The big duels, for the most part, they are obviously the tension is more built up, so they might get a bit of blow and counter blow, but we're literally talking about 3 strikes. That's about it. They each throw a spear, either they miss or they hit a shield or a cuirass or something that doesn't quite land a lethal blow, and then they move to swords, or they have another spear ready for thrusting, and that will finish the business. So all of these fights are over in the blink of an eye. So in the Iliad, when this encounter happens, I mean, Hector initially does come out of the city to fight Achilles. That's what he believes he should do. But then when Achilles bears down on him, he actually runs away. And there's this prolonged sequence where he runs around the city walls trying to avoid this fight while Achilles chases after him. He is then eventually sort of convinced by the intervention of the gods, literally, to stand and face Achilles, thinking he's going to have his battle brother Deiphobos by his side, who then disappears because it's a god in disguise. Hector is betrayed, and then in the ensuing duel, he is killed because Achilles has the support of Athena. Obviously, all of these features have been stripped out for the movie. The gods don't take part in this, so we can't have that. But also, Hector cannot be seen to run away from this fight. He is presented as just going out of the city walls and meeting the challenge because, again, he is this paragon of masculinity. He cannot possibly back down from a challenge like this. At the end of the battle, of course, Hector has tried to make this pact that they would respect each other's remains. Achilles flouts this in the most sort of infamous way. He ties the body of Hector behind his chariot and then drags it around the city wall several times before bringing it back into the Greek camp. This is the moment where, in this movie, Priam actually faints like a Victorian because this is absolutely against all the norms that are expressed in the Iliad. Heroes are supposed to have these lavish burials, and Patroclus has had that. He's had this big pyre built for him. He has funeral games. Certain gifts are laid on the pyre to be burned with the body. All of these special rituals are set aside for the heroes when they die, and this is supposed to be the way that they can be transported to the underworld. Patroclus actually appears to Achilles as a ghost and says, this is what you should do because otherwise my spirit will wander. You need to make sure that I have my proper burial that I'm owed. There's a very interesting disparity there, though, between the way that heroes are buried and the way that ordinary people who don't quite have that status are quite literally left to rot. The story opens with the line that many of the dead Greeks will be left for the birds and the dogs to devour. It left in the field to literally rot and be eaten by carrion birds, by dogs. And this is something that happens to a lot of the dead. And so the disrespect that Achilles shows to this body is something that upset the Greeks even historically. Actual ancient Greeks thought that this was way too much, that Achilles went way too far with this. And in fact, he had already done so when he threw a number of Trojan prisoners of war onto the pyre of Patroclus. He literally made a blood sacrifice on this burial mound, which was, even to the Greeks, just absolutely not done.
Who are you? I have endured what no one on earth has endured before. I kiss the hands of the man who killed my son.
This scene is completely from the actual Iliad. This is the way that the story resolves itself. The whole story of the Iliad is the wrath of Achilles. He is angry first with Agamemnon and then with Hector, but when he agrees to give Priam the body back of Hector, that is when all is forgotten and then the wrath it dissipates. And so some of these, firstly the scene where he sort of clasps the hands of Achilles, kisses his hand, that's straight from Homer. He then says this line, "I kissed the hands that killed my son." That's Homeric. He's just quoting the poem there. And the reactions between the two, the way that they treat each other, is very much the way that in this society that's sketched in the epic poems, these great lords would treat each other. There's a certain level of decorum, a certain level of respect that is owed between them, which they uphold. They respect each other's behavior, they respect each other's achievements, they respect the courage and the fighting ability, but also the willingness to go and do something like that. So Priam's willingness to risk his life to try and give his son the proper burial that I've just described. So this proper send-off, to build a pyre for him, to bury him with full honors and gifts, and to have funeral games to celebrate his great life and achievements.
Priam? How did you get in here?
I know my own country better than the Greeks, I think.
You're a brave man. I could have your head on a spit in the blink of an eye.
You really think death frightens me now? I watched my eldest son die, watched you drag his body behind your chariot. Give him back to me. He deserves the honor of a proper burial, you know that. Give him to me.
He killed my cousin.
He thought it was you. How many cousins have you killed? How many sons and fathers and brothers and husbands? How many, brave Achilles? I knew your father. He died before his time. But he was lucky not to live long enough to see his son fall. You have taken everything from me. My eldest son, heir to my throne, defender of my kingdom. I cannot change what happened. It is the will of the gods. But give me this small mercy. I loved my boy from the moment he opened his eyes till the moment you closed them. Let me wash his body. Let me say the prayers. Let me place 2 coins on his eyes for the boat.
They add this weird thing about putting coins on the eyes. Obviously, coins didn't exist yet in this time. Either the Bronze Age or the early Archaic period, doesn't matter. There were no coins in the Greek world until much later. But fundamentally, we're talking about funeral rites that are in the Iliad, at least well established. Later on, the Greek treatment of the dead changes quite a lot. But in this world, it's very important for Hector to receive these rites as a way to end his life properly and continue on into the afterlife.
Your son was the best I fought. In my country, the funeral games last for 12 days.
It is the same in my country.
Then the prince will have that honor. No Greek will attack Troy for 12 days.
And so this is where the Iliad ends. The funeral games of Hector are the closing part of the Iliad. That is the resolution of the story, the end of the wrath of Achilles, and that is where the Iliad leaves off. The rest of the story of the Trojan War, because this is very odd to us, we think that this story ends with the fall of Troy, but actually it really doesn't. The Iliad doesn't have that in mind at all. That's just going on in the background of the story that it's trying to tell. So what the movie does after this, where it continues to the trick of the horse and the fall of Troy and all these the deaths that occur in the final scenes of this film, all of that is essentially them taking material from other poems, not Homeric material, to try and kind of resolve the story in the way that we know it. So the start of the war, right down to the fall of the city and its tragic end. That is the story that we know as a Trojan War cycle. The Iliad is only a very, very small part within that. It covers the events of about a month in the 10th year of this conflict.
That's good. For my son back home.
So this is where we see in the movie unfolding the idea of the plan that will finally lead to the fall of Troy. Odysseus sitting by a fire, seeing someone carve a horse, which gives him the idea for the Trojan horse. I find it interesting that they think the horse is the essential part of the plan and not the whole like sneaking somebody in some kind of vessel so that people don't realize that they're being infiltrated. He has to see a horse before he can understand how this works. But anyway, so he decides to build this horse as something to leave behind on the beach, as some kind of implied offering to the gods for safe passage, after which the Greeks pretend to retreat, pretend to sail away. They sail to the island of Tenedos, according to the story, but in this movie they're somewhere in a bay nearby where they can be spotted. They then they sail away, they return later on. The Trojans have this discussion about what they're supposed to do with this horse.
We should take it to the temple of Poseidon.
I think we should burn it.
Burn it, my prince. It's a gift to the gods.
The prince is right. I would burn the whole of Greece if I had a big enough torch.
I warn you, good men. Be careful what you insult. Our beloved Prince Hector had sharp words for the gods.
Some of them think that this is something they should destroy because it's just something the Greeks left behind and it has something ominous about it. Others believe that this is something they should take as a trophy and bring into the city. That side prevails. It's very interesting. The Trojan horse, it's such a famous ploy, it's such a famous trick. It's only mentioned once in Homer, not in the Iliad because, as I said, it doesn't go that far forward. It's mentioned once in the Odyssey. Retrospectively, they say, oh, we know the story of the Trojan horse. It's only in other parts of this poem, which are not fully preserved, of this epic cycle, which are not well preserved, which we only have summaries, that the actual story of the Trojan horse survives. But those stories do list the heroes that are in the Trojan horse that supposedly infiltrate Troy. In this movie, Agamemnon is one of them. According to that piece of the poem, he wasn't. Menelaus actually was, but of course in this movie he's already dead. Achilles obviously was already dead by this point, according to the poem, but he in this case is in the horse. So we've confused our chronology thoroughly. If you can no longer follow who I'm even talking about, don't worry. It's a full set of characters, but at the same time, it just shows the way in which they've diverged from the story in order to put more emphasis on these leading figures and to give figures like Agamemnon the arc that they want. When later on he can say, yes, burn it all. That's obviously this sort of megalomaniac fruition of his villain arc in this story.
Let it burn! Let Troy burn! Burn it! For Menelaus! Burn it!
So this is the story of the sack of Troy, which is obviously the great sort of emotional culmination of this story, in which the good King Priam is still wandering around hoping to save some of the great city that he loves and rules and the people that he cares about.
Have you no honor? Have you no honor?
I wanted you alive, old man. I wanted you to watch your city burn.
But of course, the good King Priam is killed by the evil King Agamemnon, who at this point is having the sort of culmination of his evil plots to destroy the city. It's a very odd encounter, and as I've said already, there's a lot of mix-up between who is still alive and who is dead at this point, who is involved in this story and who isn't, according to the Iliad and other versions of the story. But fundamentally, what is being expressed here is something that's very present in the Iliad, namely that Agamemnon's designs on Troy are absolutely genocidal. He says to Menelaus that absolutely everyone should be killed. There is a very sort of poignant scene in which Menelaus tries to spare someone who is begging for his life in the middle of a fight, and Agamemnon says, no, you should not spare any of them. Even the unborn babies should be killed. So there is this idea that Agamemnon in the Iliad expresses a desire to utterly wipe out the Trojan population, which is then seen in this scene. So, to some extent, what Agamemnon wants is coming out here. This is also generally what happens to cities that fall to an enemy in the ancient world. So most of the time, as all of the adult men that can be captured, can be found, will be killed, and then all the women and children will be captured and sold into slavery. That's very much the fate that befalls cities in war, and what's being described and shown here is very much what that city historically might have expected once the enemy was within the walls.
Please. The children. Spare the innocent.
Realistically, he should have no expectation that that would happen. Either they would be murdered or they would be enslaved. We can argue over which is the worst fate. Priam certainly would not be expecting mercy of an enemy like Agamemnon. After that, we move on to various deaths, which are all out of place, but all sort of make some kind of sense within the way that the story is being told here. Agamemnon is killed by Briseis with a hidden knife, which is very odd. He does eventually get his comeuppance. He survives the war, he goes home, but his wife murders him, partly because he has shacked up with Cassandra, the Trojan princess, and seems to like her an awful lot, but also because he has actually sacrificed their daughter for safe passage to Troy. So he's sort of stacking up quite an impressive range of really heinous deeds, and Clytemnestra, his wife, essentially gets fed up and carves him up in the bath, according to later versions of the story that are dramatized by Athenian playwrights. So Agamemnon, don't worry, he does eventually get his comeuppance, but it is not in Troy. Meanwhile, Achilles is killed with arrows by Paris, which is indeed what happens in the Trojan War cycle, although not in the Iliad. But it happens before the fall of Troy. This is well before any of the events that we're seeing here supposedly happen. And in fact, one of the reasons why the Trojan Horse and that infiltration plot had to happen was because Achilles was already dead, and the Greeks had no other way of resolving the conflict. So he is shot by Paris from the walls outside the gates of Troy. And that is where we get this story of Achilles' heel, which later sources, Roman poets, introduced to the story. In the earlier Greek versions of the story, Achilles is not invincible. Doesn't necessarily have a weak spot so much as he is just a man. He is not invincible. He doesn't need a weak spot. He could be killed by anyone at any point. It's just that he is so good a fighter and has such a favor, such a divine favor, that they would never be able to get him. In later versions of the story, he becomes invincible except for his heel, which is played out in this scene where he's shot through his foot first, and that is when he becomes vulnerable and can be stuffed full of arrows. And then the endings to their arcs are also very different. So for instance, Paris and Helen both survive the Trojan War but flee Troy together, when in fact, of course, Paris is already killed by this point, and Helen is in fact recovered by Menelaus and brought back home. So all of these endings are different, but of course, because we've already killed Menelaus, there's no longer anywhere for Helen to go, so she might as well flee with the other Trojans and survive this whole story. We've gone through all the clips now, and one of the things that I hope I made clear is that there is a number of occasions where I really like the way that they're staying close to the actual source material, at least in tone, even if they do quite a bit to change the story. I mean, they've done a lot of things like stripping out the gods and changing the ending and all that, but they have on a number of occasions really expressed something fundamentally Homeric. And the best occasions, of course, are the ones where they're actually quoting the poem. I've given a number of examples of that when I said, Achilles calls Agamemnon a
sack of wine.
Or Hector is called
Hector, breaker of horses,
which is his actual epithet. There are a couple of occasions like that, and also Menelaus' whole part, and the way that the heroes treat each other, and the way that they kind of acknowledge each other's ancestry and the honor and respect that they deserve. The scene with Priam, they're doing a lot with the actual poem. They're trying to give you something of a flavor of it. And there's a couple of other occasions where that happens. One of my favorite ones is all the way at the beginning when Achilles shows up late to a battle and Agamemnon actually says to Nestor,
"Of all the warlords loved by the gods, I hate him the most."
Which is actually directly from Book 1 of the Iliad. So you have a couple of these passages where they're really saying something about what the Homeric story is, or what the poetic world was like. And in particular, I love it when these things are not necessarily the ones that we expect, not necessarily the lines that we might think, oh, this is, this clearly feels or has that flavor of ancient epic, but rather some of the lines that are most alive to us, that feel really good in their context or feel even funny, like this one.
There are no pacts between lions and men.
Achilles saying to Hector, there are no pacts between lions and men, feels almost out of context within that, but it's such a great way of expressing how Achilles stands in this scene, how he sees himself in that moment. So these kind of expressions, I think it's really great that they made space for that they allowed that to be part of the script. I hope you've enjoyed this deep dive into the movie Troy. If you did, I've also done a deep dive into 300 on this very channel. So if you like this kind of material, please like and subscribe.